The silence before a city falls is deafening. In the ancient world, when the gates finally shattered and foreign soldiers poured through broken walls, the screaming began. But for the women left behind, those who survived the initial slaughter, the nightmare had only just started. This is not a story of quick deaths or merciful ends. This is about something far more calculated, far more deliberate. A system of domination so complete, so psychologically destructive that death would have been a mercy compared to what awaited. The Babylonian Empire, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, did not simply conquer territory. They conquered identity itself. And nowhere was this machinery of psychological destruction more precise, more devastating than in what they did to captive women. What you're about to hear goes beyond physical violence. It ventures into the realm of systematic erasure of self, of culture, of hope. The Babylonians understood something that modern armies would take millennia to weaponize, that the greatest victories are not won on battlefields. They're won in the minds of those who survived them. This is the untold darkness of the Babylonian conquest machine. The psychological warfare waged not with swords, but with something far more insidious. A fate engineered to be worse than death. Babylon. Between 626 and 539 BCE, under the Neo-Babylonian Empire, this civilization reached heights of sophistication unmatched in the ancient Near East. The Hanging Gardens, the Ishtar Gate gleaming with glazed blue tile, ziggurats piercing the Mesopotamian sky, but beneath the gold leaf lay something darker. The Babylonian conquest system was not reactive, it was engineered. Every invasion followed a psychological blueprint refined over generations. The armies of Nebuchadnezzar II did not simply attack cities, they studied them. Intelligence networks mapped social structures. Priests, merchants, tribal leaders, family networks. Babylonians knew that crushing a city meant more than breaking its walls, it meant breaking its people. When Babylonian forces approached a target, the terror began long before the first arrow flew. Refugees from nearby fallen cities would arrive with stories deliberately allowed to escape, their trauma weaponized as propaganda. Tales of populations vanished into the eastern horizon, of women taken in chains never to be seen again. This was psychological warfare at its most fundamental. The goal was not to inform, it was to paralyze. The siege would be methodical. Starvation became a weapon. Disease ravaged trapped populations. And with every passing week, hope corroded like metal in water. Inside the walls, men watched their children grow thin. Mothers rationed grain that would run out long before relief could arrive. The defenders began to fracture. Accusations flew. Blame spread like infection. This internal collapse was not accidental. It was engineered. When the walls finally fell, the Babylonians wanted a population already broken, already primed for what came next. Fire would consume the granaries, the temples, the symbols of civic identity. The killing was selective, purposeful. Adult males of fighting age were slaughtered or enslaved. They represented potential resistance. The elderly were often killed outright, but the women were different. They were sorted, evaluated, categorized by age, beauty, skill, family connection. This was not passion or chaos. This was administrative. Scribes with clay tablets recorded names, origins, physical descriptions. Each woman became an entry in Babylon's vast bureaucratic machinery. The march to Babylon would take weeks, sometimes months. Chained together in long columns, these women would walk across the dust plains of Mesopotamia, leaving behind everything they had ever known. Every mile was a severing. Every dawn that rose over unfamiliar landscapes was a reminder that the world they knew was gone forever. They were no longer individuals, they were inventory, and Babylon had very specific plans for its inventory. Understanding what happened to captive women requires understanding how Babylon thought about human beings. In the Neo-Babylonian worldview, people were resources, not metaphorically, literally. The empire's texts treat populations exactly as they treat grain or livestock, quantifiable, transferable, expendable. But within this cold calculus, there were hierarchies. Young women, those of childbearing age roughly 14 to 30, were the most valuable. Physical appearance mattered, but so did class markers. Women from noble families, those who could read, those skilled in weaving or music, these carried premiums. The second tier consisted of women past prime childbearing years, but still physically capable. These would become domestic servants, laborers in textile workshops, workers in temple complexes. The third category, the elderly, the infirm, did not survive the initial selection. But the true horror lay not in this categorization. Every ancient empire practiced slavery. What made the Babylonian system uniquely devastating was what came next: the psychological reconditioning. First, they were stripped of their names. In Mesopotamian culture, names carried profound significance. They connected you to ancestors, to gods, to your city. Your name was your identity, linguistic proof that you belonged to a people, a place, a history. The Babylonians replaced these names with designations. Sometimes Babylonian names were assigned Marduk, Nabu, Ishtar. Sometimes they were simply described by origin, the woman from Judah, the Jerusalem girl. This was not administrative convenience. It was psychological surgery. By removing their names, the Babylonians severed these women from their pasts. Every time they heard themselves referred to, it reinforced that they were no longer who they had been. Second, they were forbidden to practice their native religions. Religion in the ancient world was not private spirituality, it was communal identity. Your gods defined your people. The Babylonians understood this completely. Captive women were compelled to participate in Babylonian religious rites. They would serve in temples dedicated to gods who had done the symbolic logic of ancient warfare, defeated their own deities. They would kneel before Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. Imagine the psychological weight, to be forced to worship the gods of those who destroyed your world, to perform rituals that celebrated your own subjugation, to mouth prayers in a language you barely understood. This was not merely religious coercion, it was spiritual annihilation. Third, the Babylonians controlled reproduction with chilling precision. Young captive women were systematically paired with Babylonian men soldiers, merchants, minor officials, in arrangements that served imperial purposes. Some became concubines. Others were married off in arranged unions, designed to bind conquered populations to the empire through blood ties. The children of these unions would be legally Babylonian, but their mothers, forever marked as foreign, would live knowing that even their offspring were instruments of their own erasure. The most beautiful might enter harems of nobility or royalty. They would live in luxury, fed, clothed, housed in opulence, but utterly powerless, surrounded by wealth that belonged to their conquerors, bearing children whose fathers were the architects of their homeland's destruction. Some women were assigned to temple service, not as priestesses in positions of honor, but as sacred prostitutes in the cult of Ishtar. Their bodies became religious offerings to Babylonian gods, their sexuality sacralized in service of the divine order that sanctioned their enslavement. And through all of this, the Babylonians maintained meticulous records. Clay tablets documented ownership transfers, births, deaths, productivity. Each woman's existence was reduced to cuneiform marks pressed into wet clay. They had become data points in an empire's archives. Perhaps the cruelest dimension was the psychological isolation. Captive women were deliberately dispersed. Families were separated, mothers torn from daughters, sisters scattered across different households, different cities. This was not logistical necessity, it was deliberate policy, because isolation prevents solidarity. It prevents the formation of support networks, the preservation of cultural memory, the possibility of collective resistance. A woman alone, stripped of her name, cut off from her people, forbidden her language and religion, bearing children who would never know her homeland, this woman could be controlled completely. She would not rebel because she had no one to rebel with. She would not flee because there was nowhere to flee to. The Babylonians had engineered a fate worse than death because they understood that the dead cannot serve an empire, but the broken can be made to serve forever. Among all the fates awaiting captive women in Babylon, few were as psychologically complex as assignment to the temple. Temples were not merely places of worship, they were economic powerhouses, owning land, controlling trade routes, employing thousands. And at the center stood the goddess Ishtar. Ishtar, deity of love, warfare, fertility, and sexuality, one of the most important divinities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Her temples required women, captive women, designated for temple service, entered a strange twilight existence. They were slaves, yes, their bodies owned, their futures controlled, but they also became sacred, consecrated to the goddess. This created profound psychological dissonance. For women captured from cultures with different views on sexuality and sacred space, Hebrew women, for instance, whose religion forbade exactly this kind of cultic practice, assignment to Ishtar's temple was spiritual desecration. They were being forced to perform acts their own religion condemned as abominations, acts that would sever them from their God, their people, their hope of spiritual redemption. The Babylonians understood this perfectly and used it. Young women selected for beauty would be dedicated to the goddess. Some became priestesses in traditional roles. Others became Kadishtu, women who engaged in sexual acts within the temple complex as part of religious rites. She would be dressed in the goddess's colors, taught prayers in Akkadian. Her body would be used by men she did not know, in ceremonies that violated everything her upbringing had taught her. And all of this would be framed as sacred, as honor, as service to the divine. Imagine the psychological weight. Be told that your degradation is holy, that your rape is worship, that what destroys you spiritually is, in the eyes of your captors, a blessed act pleasing to the gods. This inversion of meaning was among the most sophisticated forms of psychological control the Babylonians deployed, because it removed even the possibility of moral clarity. How do you resist when your captors insist they are honoring you? When the violence is dressed in ritual? When refusal is not just disobedience but offense against divine powers? Some women eventually internalized this framework. This was psychological survival, a way to reclaim agency in a situation that offered none. But this adaptation itself was a kind of death, the death of who they had been, the death of their original beliefs, their connection to their ancestors' faith. Others resisted internally, going through motions while holding fast to their original identities. But this resistance was its own torture, a daily battle to maintain a sense of self while performing acts that contradicted everything that self believed. And the children, if they bore children through temple service, would be raised within the temple system. Boys might become priests. Girls might follow their mothers into the same roles. The cycle perpetuated itself. What makes this so chilling is how thoroughly it exploited the human need for meaning. We cannot simply endure suffering. We need to make sense of it. The Babylonians provided that framework. They told captive women, "This is sacred. This is divinely ordained. You are not merely slaves. You are instruments of the holy." This was psychological manipulation at its most refined. The empire controlled not just bodies and labor, but the very stories women told themselves about their own lives. Some women surely saw through this narrative, but seeing through it offered no escape, only the cold knowledge that their suffering had no transcendent meaning, that it was merely exploitation wrapped in religious language. This was the particular hell of the temple system, not just violation, but the theft of even the possibility of redemptive meaning. The Babylonians had created machinery that consumed not just bodies, but souls. The most insidious dimension of the Babylonian system was not what it did to captive women, but what it did through them. Children. Every child born to a captive woman was a victory for the empire. Not a military victory, but something deeper, a demographic, cultural, psychological conquest. For a woman torn from her homeland, her children represented the final severance. They would not remember Jerusalem or Tyre. They would not speak her native language fluently. They would not worship at her altars. They would be Babylonian, and she would be required to make them so. This was the cruelest requirement of all, that captive mothers become agents of their own people's extinction, that they raise children who would absorb Babylonian values, who would perhaps even feel shame at their mother's foreign origins. Children born to captive women took their father's status. If the father was Babylonian, the child was legally Babylonian. The mother's heritage became irrelevant. These children were raised speaking Akkadian as their primary language. They were educated in Babylonian religion, learning to honor Marduk and Nabu and Ishtar, and crucially they were given Babylonian names, names that erased their maternal heritage, names that ensured they would be marked as Babylonian. For the mothers, watching this transformation must have been agonizing. To see your child grow up not knowing who your people were, to watch them adopt the beliefs and loyalties of the civilization that had enslaved you, to hear them pray to gods you were taught to despise. Some mothers surely tried to resist, to teach their children in secret, to whisper stories of their homeland when masters were not listening, but the system worked against them. Their children interacted with Babylonian society, absorbed Babylonian culture at every turn. Whatever the mother taught in private would be contradicted and overwhelmed. And as children grew older, many would come to see their mother's attempts at cultural preservation as embarrassing, as marks of inferiority. Why cling to the identity of conquered peoples when you could be Babylonian? Why honor gods who had lost to Babylon's gods? From the children's perspective, especially second-generation children who had never known their mother's homeland's assimilation was rational. It was survival. It was the path to social advancement. But for the mothers, each step of their children's assimilation was a small death. Within 2 generations, entire conquered populations could be absorbed. The grandchildren of captive women would have only vague awareness of their origins. Great-grandchildren would know nothing at all. Cultural memory would dissolve like salt in water. This is why the fate of captive women was worse than death. Because death is fine, it ends suffering. But what the Babylonians imposed was a living erasure that extended across generations. The women themselves might live for decades, carrying the memory of who they had been, but they would watch that memory die in their children, watch it fade in their grandchildren, and they could do nothing to stop it. The machinery of empire was too vast, too pervasive. Resistance was not merely futile, it was unthinkable. And so they stayed, and bore children, and watched those children become strangers to them. This was the final triumph of Babylonian psychological warfare, not to destroy their enemies, but to transform them, to take the women of conquered peoples and turn them into the mothers of Babylonians. Every child born was a conquest that did not need to be won through violence. The bodies were enslaved, but it was the bloodlines that were conquered, and that conquest was designed to last forever. We know about Babylonian treatment of captive women not just from administrative texts, but from something more intimate, the testimony of survivors. The Hebrew Bible preserves the trauma of Babylonian captivity in ways that are both powerful and haunting. The destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE and the subsequent deportations, the Babylonian exile left deep scars in Jewish cultural memory, and women's suffering is woven throughout these texts. The Book of Lamentations mourns the fall of Jerusalem. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. The city itself is personified as a woman, a widow, violated. Later verses become more explicit. Women are raped in Zion, virgins in the towns of Judah. These brief lines carry the weight of systematic brutality. Psalm 137 captures the specific torment of captivity. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept, when we remembered Zion. For there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors, mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? This is the voice of the exiled, commanded to perform, to entertain, to demonstrate their cultural heritage for the amusement of their captors. And the final verses reveal the depth of rage such treatment produced. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed, blessed shall he be who repays you with what you have done to us. Blessed shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. Shocking words. But they reflect the psychological state of people who had been so thoroughly traumatized that they could wish genocide upon their oppressors. The prophetic books contain additional fragments. Ezekiel writes from exile, his visions bizarre and hallucinatory, possibly reflecting trauma-induced psychological states. He describes Jerusalem as an unfaithful wife who will be punished through exposure and violence. The sexual metaphors are explicit and disturbing. What makes these texts valuable is how they preserve the interiority of the experience. They tell us what it felt like, the shame, the grief, the rage, the desperate attempts to maintain identity in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate. The Lamentations passages about mothers eating their children during the siege reflect the complete breakdown of normal social structures under Babylonian siege warfare. The references to women's sexual violation are numerous and blunt. The prophets describe rape as weapon, as policy, as inevitable consequence of conquest. Later, when some exiles returned to Jerusalem after Babylon's fall, there was controversy over mixed marriages. Ezra and Nehemiah demanded that Hebrew men divorce their foreign wives and disown their children. This harsh policy reflects the fear of assimilation, the terror of cultural dissolution. But think about what this meant for the women involved. Whether they were Babylonian women who had married Hebrew men or Hebrew women who had married Babylonians, they faced rejection. Their children born from unions created by captivity, by force, by imperial design were declared illegitimate, cast out. Even in liberation, the victims could not escape the system's effects, because that is what systematic psychological warfare does. It creates wounds that persist across generations. It fractures communities. It leaves scars that never fully heal. The Hebrew Bible is, among other things, a record of collective trauma, an entire people processing their suffering through poetry, prophecy, and narrative. And at the center, again and again, are the women, the violated, the enslaved, the mothers of mixed children. Their suffering is never centered. The texts were written by men, but it is there, woven throughout, impossible to miss. These women were not merely victims. They were survivors of one of history's most sophisticated systems of psychological domination. The fact that Hebrew identity survived it all is testament to the resilience of those who endured, but that survival came at enormous cost, measured in broken families, traumatized psyches, lost children, and permanent scarring of cultural memory. The Babylonian Empire eventually fell, its cities crumbled, its gods were forgotten. But the wounds it inflicted persisted long after the last brick of Babylon turned to dust. To understand why the Babylonian system was so effective, we must examine the psychological mechanisms it exploited. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. We can survive almost unimaginable suffering if we retain hope, identity, and social connection. The Babylonians systematically targeted all three. First, the destruction of hope. Hope requires belief that circumstances might improve, that suffering might end. The Babylonians demolished this at every level. The initial violence sent a clear message: resistance is futile. When cities fell, when populations were marched hundreds of miles into captivity, it created absolute helplessness. And in Babylon itself, this message was reinforced daily. The scale of the city demonstrated imperial permanence. This was not temporary. This was forever. Captive women were told they would never return home, that their cities were destroyed or impossibly distant, that their families were dead or scattered beyond recovery. This comprehensive destruction of hope is psychologically devastating. Without hope, people enter states of learned helplessness, where even opportunities for escape cannot be perceived or acted upon. Second, the erasure of identity. Identity is constructed through narrative, the story we tell ourselves about who we are. It is reinforced through symbols, names, language, religious practices, cultural customs. The Babylonians attacked all of these simultaneously. By changing names, they disrupted the most basic element of identity. By forbidding native languages and religions, they eliminated cultural practices that reinforced ethnic identity. By dispersing families, they destroyed the social networks that sustained collective identity. Day after day, year after year, the old identity eroded while a new one was imposed. What makes this insidious is that humans need identity. We cannot function without some sense of who we are. When the old identity is stripped away, we construct a new one from available materials. The Babylonians controlled those materials, which meant they could shape the new identities that emerged. This is the sophistication of their system. They did not simply impose a new identity through brute force. They created conditions where adopting a new identity was the path of least psychological resistance. Third, the destruction of social connection. Humans derive meaning, support, and resilience from relationships. Isolation is one of the most effective forms of psychological torture. By separating families, scattering community members across different households and cities, the Babylonians prevented support networks. A woman alone had no one who understood her language, her religion, her memories. This isolation served multiple purposes. It prevented organized resistance. It accelerated cultural assimilation, and it created profound psychological vulnerability. Isolated people are easier to control. They cannot organize. Their suffering remains individual, unable to coalesce into collective action. And crucially, isolation made captive women dependent on their captors for all social connection. If your master's household were your only daily human contacts, you would inevitably develop complex psychological relationships with them. You would learn to read moods, anticipate desires, perform roles in ways that minimized punishment. This was not collaboration, it was survival. These three mechanisms, destruction of hope, erasure of identity, and isolation, worked in concert to create control so complete that physical chains became almost unnecessary. Women in this system were psychologically imprisoned. Even when opportunities for escape existed, they could not perceive or act on them. And the brilliance of the system was that it did not require constant violence to maintain. After the initial conquest trauma, the system ran on its own momentum, because the captives themselves, having been so thoroughly broken, became complicit in their own subjugation. They taught their children Babylonian. They participated in religious rites. They fulfilled assigned roles, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative seemed impossible. The Babylonians had engineered a psychological trap so sophisticated that the prisoners maintained it themselves. This is what true power looks like. Not crude force, but the shaping of reality itself, the control not just of bodies, but of minds. And it worked. For centuries, the Babylonian Empire absorbed conquered populations, turned their women into instruments of assimilation, and expanded without requiring constant military conquest. The system was sustainable, efficient, and from the empire's perspective, remarkably humane. No mass killings, no spectacular cruelties. But from the perspective of those subjects, from the perspective of the women whose identities were erased, whose children were stolen through cultural engineering, this system was anything but humane. It was machinery of annihilation, slower than genocide, more complete than massacre, and it left no monuments, no mass graves, no obvious evidence, just clay tablets recording transactions, just demographic shifts, just the ghostly traces of languages that stopped being spoken, religions that ceased being practiced. The women who suffered left almost no direct testimonies. Their voices are nearly silent in the historical record, but that silence itself speaks volumes, because silencing is what the system was designed to do. Conclusion: the inheritance of trauma, 27 minutes and 0 seconds to 30 minutes and 0 seconds. The Babylonian Empire fell in 539 BCE. The Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon without significant resistance. Empires are mortal, but trauma is not. The women who suffered under Babylonian control did not suddenly become whole when the empire fell. The psychological damage did not reverse, the stolen years did not return. When Persian conquest allowed some Hebrew exiles to return to Jerusalem, they found a land they barely recognized. Decades had passed. The returnees were strangers in what had been their ancestors' homeland. Some women chose to return, but many did not. Because what was there to return to? They had children in Babylon, Babylonian children. They had lives, constrained and painful, but lives nonetheless. Returning meant abandoning those children. Returning meant starting over in a ruined city. Returning meant confronting unbearable memories. There were no good choices. Every path was marked by loss. This is the final truth about what the Babylonians did to captive women. It was not just the suffering of the moment. It was the permanent alteration of futures, the poisoning of multiple generations. Trauma of this scale does not heal. It transforms into something else, into cultural memory, into religious practices shaped by the need to ensure such suffering never happens again. The Jewish experience of Babylonian exile shaped Judaism profoundly. The emphasis on law, on textual tradition, on maintaining identity even in diaspora, all of this has roots in the Babylonian experience. When you cannot control territory, you control culture. When you cannot defend your cities, you defend your identity. These became survival strategies forged in trauma, and they worked. Jewish identity survived Babylon, but survival came at a cost measured in shattered families, traumatized psyches, and the permanent loss of those who were absorbed into empires and forgotten. The women whose suffering we have explored most left no names in history. No monuments mark their graves. No inscriptions preserve their stories. They exist now only as archaeological traces, as fragments in ancient texts, as statistical shadows. But their suffering was real. Their identities were real. Their lost futures were real. And understanding what was done to them is not just academic history. It is recognizing a pattern of domination that has repeated throughout human civilization. Every conquest that deliberately targets women and children, every system that uses reproduction as a weapon of cultural transformation, all of these echo Babylon. The methods have evolved, the scale has changed, but the underlying psychology remains constant, because humans have not fundamentally changed in 4,000 years. Our need for identity, our vulnerability to isolation, our capacity for both resilience and breaking, these are timeless. And so the techniques for exploiting these vulnerabilities remain effective. The Babylonian captive women were not unique in history. They are one well-documented example of a phenomenon that has occurred countless times. Their suffering stands as representative of all the unnamed, unrecorded, forgotten women who have endured similar fates throughout human history. This documentary has tried to give voice to that suffering, to make visible what empires prefer to keep invisible. Not to wallow in horror, but to understand, to recognize, to remember, because forgetting is the final victory of oppression. By remembering, by understanding the psychological mechanisms of ancient conquest, we honor those who endured, and we arm ourselves to recognize and resist when similar systems emerge. The Babylonian Empire is 4,000 years gone, but the shadow it cast, the knowledge it generated about how to break human beings psychologically, that shadow reaches across the century. The women of Babylon cannot speak for themselves, but their silence speaks volume about the cost of empire, about the price of conquest, about what it means to be denied even the dignity of death, and instead subjected to something worse, a living annihilation, a fate engineered to last beyond the individual, to poison generations, to erase peoples from history itself. This was the dark genius of the Babylonian system. The machinery of empire is ancient, but so is the human capacity to witness, to remember, and to refuse to let suffering be forgotten. For the women who cannot speak, for the identities that were erased, for the futures that were stolen, they deserve to be remembered, not just as victims, but as human beings whose lives, whose suffering mattered. 4,000 years have not diminished that truth. The Babylonian Empire is dust, but the women it broke deserve more than silence. They deserve this, to be seen, to be understood, to be remembered. Even now, especially now, their suffering was real, and it mattered, and it matters still.